Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you very much for joining Physicians for Human Rights Israel's webinar on the crisis in the Israeli prison system and incarceration system since October 2023. Before I jump into introducing our speakers and passing the floor to them, I would like to give a few numbers that I think illustrate the gravity of the crisis that we're experiencing in this area. Even if we look at the situation in Israeli incarceration settings before October, we were already witnessing a severe deterioration of the situation under Israel's ultra-right-wing government and the not so newly appointed anymore minister who oversees the Israel Prison Service, Itamar Ben-Gvir. There was already a rise in the number of administrative detainees and in conditions of detention for Palestinian detainees. And still, if we compare the numbers from September 2023 to where we are now, I think it gives a real illustration of the gravity of the situation. The overall number of Palestinians defined as security detainees has doubled since September 2023 from about 5,000 to about 10,000. The number of administrative detainees has almost tripled from around 1,250 to around 3,400. These are people who are held without trial and there isn't sufficient evidence to bring an indictment against them. A whole new category of administrative detainees of sorts has been created, those that Israel refers to as unlawful combatants. These are people arrested from the Gaza Strip during the fighting and against whom there isn't sufficient evidence to bring an indictment. They are held incommunicado and with grave rights violations. So there are about 1,400 people as of yesterday in Israeli custody, meaning there are almost 5,000 people under the two types of administrative detention. One group that is especially concerning to us at Physicians for Human Rights Israel is healthcare workers arrested from Gaza during the fighting in the Strip. We know of about 130 healthcare workers who have been incarcerated since October. Currently, there are about 100 left. And we know for sure of 56 people, Palestinians, who have died in Israeli incarceration settings since October. The real number is likely much higher. And I'm sure some of my colleagues will delve into this issue as our webinar goes on. I will introduce our speakers, and I would just like to say that if you have any questions that arise during the webinar, please feel free to write them in the YouTube live or our Facebook live. We will try to address them in the final 10 or 15 minutes of the webinar. Our speakers tonight are Ms. Oneg Ben Dror, who is a project coordinator at Physicians for Human Rights Israel's Prisoners and Detainees Department, Ms. Hadas Ziv, Director of Ethics at PHRI, and Dr. Lina Qassem Hassan, who is the chairperson of our board of directors and a family doctor who has accompanied incarcerated Palestinians for years. So the first question I would like to address to Oneg. Oneg, can you give us a few words of background on the Israeli detention system in general and what the situation has been like since October, especially as they relate to conditions of detention for Palestinians and the provision of healthcare?
Sure. So I think it's important to mention that also before the current war, the conditions in prison were hard. At work, we were dealing with hundreds of cases of medical neglect and delays in therapy. We witness cases of torture of Palestinians, mainly in interrogations, and also cases of sexual abuse. Also, excessive use of solitary confinement and coercive measures, especially against people with mental disabilities. And that also, in the last point, it also for both, for Palestinians who are classified by Israel as security prisoners and also people who are classified as criminal prisoners. The change, the deterioration that we saw, I mean, to another degree, has started already since the current government, and the assigned minister, Ben-Gvir, who came into office, and he stated it very clearly that he wanted to make the lives of Palestinians miserable. They tried to pass a law like the death penalty for Palestinians, also trying to decrease the quantity and quality of food for Palestinians, and also trying to pass a law that limits the treatment, the medical treatment and medical care that Palestinians will get in prison, calling it a life-improving treatment. And I can tell you, and also Lina can elaborate on that, there is no such a medical definition of life-improving treatment. You know, every medical treatment can be life-improving, including treatment for cancers or other. And what happened, I would say, after the war started, basically is that what, let's say, Ben-Gvir tried to pass through laws, he implemented as policy without the need to do it through new laws. The prison service declared a lockdown policy on all Palestinians in prison, or classified as security prisoners. It means a long confiscation, confinement to the cells, shortcuts of water and electricity, confiscation of all private property. People were left with only the clothes they were wearing, even T-shirt, throughout the winter. Denied of family visits for Palestinian prisoners, denying the ICRC, the Red Cross, to enter all detention facilities. Also decreasing the amount of food to a very low quality and quantity. People were losing dozens of kilos, some 15, some more than 20 kilos only after a few months in detention. And besides that, Palestinians in prison were facing violence, torture and abuse, which also ended with broken bones and death cases. Regarding medical treatment, at the beginning, the people couldn't go to the clinics inside prison. And even when they were asked, they were beaten for only asking to see a doctor. And that's the situation basically inside the prison service. Besides that, also the Israeli army started also to be one of the forces who are in charge of custody. So in the case of Gazan detainees, the Israeli army arrested thousands of people, especially after the ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. They arrested people also from protected places, such as hospitals and schools and shelters. Also minors, age 6 and also age 82. We had a case of a woman who is 82 with Alzheimer, who was detained. Some were detained inside the Gaza Strip, and some were brought to military bases. And I guess we will elaborate on that later. I would just say that throughout the first more than 6 months, the Israeli army refused to provide any information about where the Gazan detainees are being held, under which conditions, which status, and we call it enforcement disappearance.
Thank you for that background, Oneg. First of all, I realized that I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. So my name is Lee Caspi, and I'm the Director of Resource Development at PHRI. I see we're already getting some questions, and we will try to address them a little bit later on after we talk about some of the background first. Obviously, PHRI's main area or entry point is health and the provision of healthcare services to incarcerated people. So Hadas is somebody whose area of expertise is medical ethics and the Israeli medical system. Which violations of medical ethics have we seen over the last few months in the context of detention, and what dynamics has the situation brought about within the Israeli medical system? Are you muted? Or?
Now you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I would say that later on we'll speak about Sde Teiman, but Sde Teiman, the establishment of a field hospital, is the result of a failure of the medical system to treat Palestinian detainees in its public hospitals. So I think that this is the most basic grave violation, because at the beginning, when the army arrested Palestinians, they brought them if they were wounded, and many of them were wounded because it's a war situation and you have shot wounds and critical situations. They were brought into the public hospitals. Now, I would not say that this is not a challenge. It is a challenge, and one should have taken care of separation in different departments or different rooms, because you don't want to see victims and perpetrators in the same place, etc. Or civilians were threatening the medical teams that were treating Palestinians. So you need to keep off the security of the teams and of the prisoners themselves. So there were a lot of challenges, but from the very start, you could see the failure of the medical system and its ethics. First, from the mere leadership, from the Minister of Health. Although, let's say, the professional level in the Ministry of Health said, be prepared to treat a patient, they spoke both of Lebanon and from Gaza. This was the directive to the hospital directors. The Minister of Health immediately said, no, we refuse to accept those people in our hospitals. So from the top down, you see refusal to treat. And then different directors of hospitals and seniors in hospitals spoke about not willing to have those people in their hospitals, a refusal. And even if they didn't refuse out open and publicly, they tried to avoid having them. And once they were admitted, they were treated very, very shortly, the most necessary treatment, and then back into the prison or custody system. We got and all the information that we have from whistleblowers, which I'll elaborate maybe later on how the medical system treated their own people. There was anonymity. They were treated with eyes covered, handcuffed. They came very shabby clothes, some of them half naked, and the hospital would not report this. Doctors would not ask for the people to talk to them, see what they want. So everything was very, very anonymous and very, very short. Even painkillers, we were told, were considered to be a luxury. So I would say, first of all, it's a failure of the civil public health system. And this is what later on brought what we'll see in Sde Teiman.
Yes, thank you for this lead up. I would just like to, before we move on to a question I have for Lina, to refer to one thing that Oneg brought up in her introductory remarks, which is the role of the Red Cross and the denial of access. If you could maybe say just a few words about the meaning of this denial in practice and our ability to even access Palestinians in detention since October 7th and get information about what is happening with them.
Sure. First of all, we are not aware of another case that a state simply denied access in such a way. And now there is a hearing that we are also part of regarding that, to provide access to the Red Cross. And basically the answer that we get from the state is that they try to replace the Red Cross to something else. It's still going on, so we will see how it develops. Regarding access to prisons and also to Gaza detainees, so I would say that in general, at the moment, the only access is through lawyers. And even in prison, it can be very hard to get an appointment. There are prisons that there were months that it was simply impossible. And even when lawyers got appointment, they came, and it happened several times, and then the prison service declared an emergency situation, and then they didn't let them. Besides that, and I think it's important to mention that people were beaten for having a lawyer visit, and still are. And with the Gaza detainees, it's even more sensitive. So I guess we will also talk about it later, but there are also, besides, so there are Gaza detainees who are being held in military bases, and also some are being transferred to the prison service. Now there is a very limit, but there are some Gaza detainees that lawyers were able to visit. But we can say that everything concerning Gaza detainees, it's even for all Palestinians in prison, it's we know that they are subjected to violence and abuse. Even now, so for instance, at the beginning they didn't allow people to have access to medical care. Now there are people are able to go to the clinic to some degree, or to hospitals, but they are getting beaten on the way, in places in prison where there are no cameras. And yeah, so at the moment, the only access is through lawyers, but it is also very sensitive and can harm the Palestinians inside.
Thank you for clarifying that point, which I think is a very central one to understand how difficult it even is to understand what is happening in Israeli incarceration settings at the moment. But going back to what we started delving into with Hadas, Lina, I want to address a question to you. You're a doctor, a Palestinian doctor working within the Israeli medical system. Could you tell us a little bit about how this issue looks or is talked about from your perspective and the perspective of your workplace, your colleagues? What is the debate or the discourse among your colleagues around the fact that, as Hadas explained, treatment within the Israeli medical system since October has been limited at best, and some people have refused to engage with it? And if you would also like to tell us a little bit about your work with incarcerated Palestinians before October, then I'm sure people here would be interested to hear about it.
Okay, thank you, Lee, and good evening, everyone. Actually, my experience with Palestinian prisoners in Israel has started so many years ago. I read many prisoners' medical files and treated hunger strikers. And from my interaction with the medical system in the Israeli prison services, the impression is that the system lacks minimal medical quality standards. Actually, the medical staff is poorly trained, and the main problem is that the medical system inside the Israeli jail is managed by the IPS, the Israel Prison Services, which belongs to the Ministry of the National Security, which is headed by Ben-Gvir right now, and not by the Ministry of Health. And the medical teams are actually committed to their employer and not to their patients, which are the prisoners in this case. And that results in a confidence problem and a trust problem between the prisoners and their doctors. And what actually happens, there is some noise, is that the prisoners see their doctors as part of the incarcerating system that violates their basic rights, actually. And as we know, that does not enable a professional patient-doctor relationship. Another problem is that the IPS medical teams are not part of the Israel Medical Association and are not committed to its ethical guidelines, and we can talk a lot about these ethical guidelines later. As mentioned before, the conditions in which the Palestinian prisoners were held were very bad for so many years, much before October 7th. And in the last year before October 7th, there was a very, the strategy that was suggested by Ben-Gvir to worsen their conditions even more, including forbidding family visits, making food and getting education, as Oneg mentioned before. And since October 7th, the situation is catastrophic in every possible level. We're talking about minimizing the food amounts, about no personal equipment. Prisoners are sleeping on the floor, shackled in their hands and in their legs for 24 hours, not allowed to get showered, and also denying and not supplying actually appropriate medical care. That all directly actually influences the prisoner's health, and as we saw, it resulted in amputations of extremities and cases of death also. The IPS, what happened is after October 7th, the IPS actually stopped all the health services to the prisoners for a few months, and the Physicians for Human Rights addressed the Ministry of Health about that issue, and that Ministry of Health in Israel just ignored it. Another point is that the numbers of the prisoners, as Oneg mentioned, is extremely getting larger and larger. We are talking about 3,500 administrative detainees compared to 1,300 before October 7th. Unfortunately, what we see in the light of all this data, that the medical community in Israel never stood up against these violations, including in cases that the medical ethics were violated in a very obvious way. I can give an example, like cases of hunger strikers. We're talking all about before October 7th, yeah? Hunger strikers that were discharged back to die in jail in critical conditions. We all remember the case of Khadr Adnan, the prisoner who was found dead. He was, after 120 days of hunger strike in the Israel Prison Services medical facility in Ramla in May 2023. I examined Khadr 1 week before he died, and we in Physicians for Human Rights demanded to transfer him for observation in a public hospital, and that never happened. Every time he was released back to jail until he finally was found dead. And since October 7th, we see that the most we never heard any condemnation of the ethical committee of Israel Medical Association about these actions. And we can see that most of the medical teams in Israel are totally enlisted to the war agenda without thinking about the ethical dilemmas involved in treating the detainees, being actually exposed to torturing them, and feeling the duty as physicians to report. And even in some cases, we saw that some health personnel actively participated in these crimes and supported them. When the Israeli hospitals refused to give medical care to the Gazan detainees, that was seen as a legitimate, actually, in the eyes of the Israeli medical system, even if these prisoners were treated in Israeli hospitals. As Hadas mentioned, they were given the most basic treatment and released after a few hours for observation in the incarcerating facilities, which are not suitable for this kind of observation. This atmosphere in the medical system in Israel was possible only under the support of the Israeli Ministry of Health. I would like to add that actually Israel Medical Association always gave backup to the violations in Sde Teiman, regardless to the detainees' rights according to the international law. What happens is that instead of being the guards to medical ethics, the medical system in Israel played a negative role in justifying the atrocities happening in Sde Teiman. Some of the doctors who were exposed to these atrocities were whistleblowers and reported the violations done in Sde Teiman. Physicians for Human Rights wrote a report about these violations and sent the report to the Israel Medical Association that reacted in justifying these actions for security reasons, as this phrase is always used, and leaving these doctors alone facing multiple ethical dilemmas that we can address later. I would like to say that it is shocking that the IMA, the Israel Medical Association, kept silent in the face of the ongoing Israeli policy of targeting the hospitals and massively arresting medical staff in Gaza. That resulted in totally destroying the Gazan medical system. As we know, more than 100 medical personnel have been arrested, and our colleagues, they are doctors just like ourselves. Okay, they graduated from medical school and they work in hospitals, and they are held in Israeli incarcerating facilities in an inhuman, illegal conditions and in torture in some cases, which have led, as we all know, to the death of two senior doctors under the Israeli captivity, Dr. Adnan El-Borsh and Dr. Iyad El-Rantisi. And yesterday, we all heard the testimony of Dr. Muhammad Abu Salmiye, the director of Al-Shifa Hospital, about the conditions he and his colleagues were held in jail, about denying the basic rights of food and medical care, and about daily physical and mental humiliation all the prisoners got, and about the fact that doctors and nurses also beated them in the prisons. So
thank you, Lina. I would like us to take.
I just want to add one sentence, and because it's very important. Dr. Abu Salmi was released without charges. That proves actually the fact that the policy of arresting medical personnel was used to ruin the health system in Gaza as a war instrument.
Thank you. You've touched on so many important issues, and I would like us to stop and delve into some of them in a little bit more detail. I would like to, Oneg, if you could a little bit later address the question of the detention of healthcare facilities and some of healthcare practitioners and some of PHRI's work on some of these cases. But before that, I would like to address a question to Hadas about Sde Teiman, which is a name that has become notorious, and people who are following what's happening in the context of incarceration of Gazans in this war have heard this name. It has appeared in many international news outlets, in large part due to the fact that PHRI received information and exposed what we know to be happening there. Lina touched a little bit on severe violations of medical ethics and the complicity of the Israeli medical system in this. Can you talk a little bit to what we heard from there, how we heard it, and how the response was within the Israeli medical system?
Okay, first of all, I want to say that Sde Teiman, or let's say a field hospital, is not necessarily a bad thing, okay? It happens and but Sde Teiman is not a field hospital per se. It is something that is not a hospital because from the beginning, the directives of the Ministry of Health, and it's an official document, saying that the standards are lowered, not only professional medical standard, but also ethical standard. There's nothing there about your obligation to report abuse. And when you speak about a situation where you are imprisoning someone who's the enemy and in the atmosphere of the Israeli society, this is a must. Also, there's no obligation to get informed consent. There is, you have to be really a saint in order to try and communicate. There's no translation sometimes. So even if a doctor, let's say, and I have to stress it, the doctors that went to Sde Teiman at the beginning were the doctors that thought that it is imperative to treat those people. So from the beginning, you had the more humane or the more ethical doctors that volunteered to go there. Another thing that I must stress, they were recruited to a military service, but were not part of the medical teams of the Israeli army. So they were in some kind of a limbo. Who's in charge? Who gives us the directives? Who actually allows us to refer a patient when we want to? Who gives us the equipment? So everything in the directives of the Ministry of Health were lowering the standards, both ethical and professional. And I just want to read something that the doctor anonymously wrote, and it was published in Haaretz. And he says, each of us, whether it is the medical personnel or you, the supervising authorities at the Health and Defense Ministry, is implicated in breaching Israeli law. Even more concerning for me as a physician is the breach of my commitment to provide equal treatment to all patients, a vow I pledged to uphold upon graduating 2 decades ago. So these are the whistleblowers, the people who were honestly trying to treat people, try to improve, try to pressure the Ministry of Health, the Israeli Medical Association. So the silence, and I want to speak about the silence of the Israeli Medical Association in a minute. The silence is not just, a silence because they don't answer us as a human rights group. It's a silence to their members. Actually, they're turning their backs to the members. The members are trying to have a guidance, both ethical, conscience, professional, and they are just being ignored. And this is just saying you have to follow the rules, every patient has to be treated equally. This is not enough. In a situation where society pressures you to not treat them equally, when the Ministry of Health is saying don't treat them at all, this is a situation where you need a proactive, very open and let's say even aggressive Israeli Medical Association to try and protect those doctors from all the pressures that they are facing. And in this, I see a big, big failure. And what we see in patients when they do arrive to the hospitals, again, from whistleblowers, from doctors who really care, is neurological damages from being held tight for so irreversible damages. So death is one thing, the extreme cases we learn about, but the mental, neurological, and for doctors to be seeing this and see that no one cares, and even that they are treating those people, they are being attacked by their peers. So I think that this is a situation whereby it is almost impossible to be an ethical doctor in Sde Teiman, and therefore this is why we got to the conclusion, close Sde Teiman. You cannot leave doctors there because by definition, they cannot act professionally or ethically. And this is why we call on the closure of Sde Teiman, not only of the hospital, but of the whole compound, which is a terrible, terrible place. And if we learn something from our colleagues in the US, human rights groups, medical groups, Abu Ghraib cannot be improved. So Sde Teiman also. Don't have the illusion that if you reform here or you reform there, you will get something better. No, it's impossible.
I think that's a really good point on which to transfer a question to Oneg. Both if you can address the incarceration of medical personnel, but actually, you said something when we were preparing for this webinar in the office earlier today, which I think is an important question to address, which is, okay, what's happening in Sde Teiman now? We are seeing some improvements, but as you told me earlier today, Sde Teiman is not the end of this struggle, because there is a new Sde Teiman, as you termed it. So can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing now at Sde Teiman and what you mean by the new Sde Teiman?
Sure. So maybe I will start with, Sde Teiman is located near Beersheva, around 31 kilometers from the closest point in the Gaza Strip. It's a military base. It's a very big military base, and it's kind of an open air prison, cages where people are being held. And a few meters away, there is the field hospitals, a big tent with about 15 beds. Inside the cages, people are being held with their eyes covered and handcuffed all day. They have to sit, and they are not allowed to speak with each other, otherwise they are subjected to violent punishment. It was very hard to get information about what is happening there. And as Hadas mentioned before, also we got it from whistleblowers as well as from people who were released. We understood that there were about 800 people who were detained there. And once we understood better what is going on, we tried to put the spotlight on this place. And as Hadas said before, we called for the closure of all this facility. What is happening now? There is appeal about the closure of Sde Teiman, and detainees were being transferred. And according to Israel, Gazan detainees were being transferred to another military base. They built a new one in Ofer. In Ofer, you have a prison and also a military base. Actually, Gazan detainees are being held in both, but now they build a new facility in the military base. And there, people are still handcuffed the whole time, even though they are there. We understood that they are cells, but people in some places, people are even handcuffed to each other, even when they are going to the toilet. And some were being transferred to a prison in the south called Ktsiot. The conditions there are horrible. So as you said, we don't stop there. We have to stop what is going on in prison in general. And I would say, Lina mentioned before basically the silence, or maybe in the good case of the health system, and also the cooperation. Even when the Israel Medical Association did call to admit Gazan patients, they called them, and also other Palestinians, they called them terrorists. I also want to mention how the court system allow all of this to happen. So already in November, we appealed to court, and we sent very, very detailed information to different decision makers about the abuse, about the conditions, about everything. We based on dozens of testimonies, and simply the court refused and still to protect Palestinians, and found the the lack of provision of water to Palestinians in prison as a justified security, that it has a security purpose, and it's a justified one. So I think it's important to see how all these authorities and factors allow this to happen. And also I want to mention the death cases of Palestinians, both in prison and in military bases. I think it's important to say that until today, already in December, we heard of Gazan detainees who died in custody. And we sent a Freedom of Information request asking very simple question: how many Gazan died under Israeli custody, and especially in the Israeli army? And we still didn't get an answer for that question. There are different off-the-record answers that the Israeli army is providing to report to journalists and others, but still no official numbers. Also in prison, there are confirmed by Israel about 15 cases of people who died since October in prison, and I want to mention it's really unprecedented number. And our physicians participated in some of the autopsies. In some, there were severe indications and signs for violence, internal bleeding and broken bones. And in some, it was very clear that it was medical neglect. There was one guy, Mohammed Sabah, who was 21 years old. He died in February in Ofer prison. He had a stomach disease, and he needed a very simple thing. He needed an adapted diet that was known to the prison service, but he didn't get it, and he suffered for weeks until he was finally hospitalized in a hospital, but it was already too late, and a few hours later they determined his death. And I would say that also the last cases that we know of, and there are also cases that are still not confirmed that we know of. So we are talking of dozens of people in prison and in military bases by the Israeli army custody who died. The last cases in prison were mostly of people who suffer from chronic disease. And this is also why we think now it is even more dangerous because the time has its effect. So maybe, for instance, in the case of medical neglect, a few months can be handled in some cases, but more than 8 months, it's already a different story.
I would add that silence is a compliment. It's not silence. And I think that this is such a low point of the medical community in Israel that it will take us, I don't know, a very long time to reconstruct our ethics, because actually it's been compliant with things that we should never be compliant with. It's to see violence and not report it, is to accept medical neglect. And it's even to write, as I think Lina mentioned, to write a letter supporting the bombardment of Shifa. So it is a medical system that is very close to the security system, to the military system, and actually adopts its values and being used as a tool by the government, by a very extreme, crazy government, and as if it is the judge, the executioner, and I fear for what are we going to be left when it is all over? What is to become of the medical community, of the medical education? And you can see that the Israeli Medical Association can be very proactive when they want to defend And I do not think that it is wrong. I think that they should defend a doctor that is demonstrating or helping demonstrators against the government. But why weren't they vocal? Why didn't they threaten with demonstrations or a strike when they saw all of the things that are happening? Why are they being willing to be a tool of vengeance, of revenge, of the very basic things? And why don't they find their ethics and professionalism as something that they can be proud of and insist on? This is I'm very disappointed.
So I think I wanted to address one last question to you, Lina, before we close up this debate and move on to try and address some questions that we received. You had mentioned again when we were preparing for this webinar some specific engagement you had with this issue through your work as a medical practitioner, which I think would be a very interesting example for people here to hear about.
Yeah. I have actually two engagements. One, what Hadas mentioned before about this letter of 100 doctors that in November signed, Israeli doctors, this letter that called the Israeli army to bomb Al-Shifa hospital and other hospitals in Gaza. And that's right, that the Israel Medical Association condemned this letter, and it was condemned internationally everywhere in the world. But no sanctions were taken against these doctors, and they are still working in the system, and they are still giving care for patients, and they are still one of them is, for example, my direct boss, and he is a mentor, and he is an educator in the medical field, and he is responsible for more than 200 residents. And I can just imagine what role is he playing in the medical ethics in Israel. The other case that I would like to share with you as an example for what we are speaking about, I am actually a family physician, and I teach medical ethics classes to young residents in family medicine in Haifa, in the north of Israel, Jews and Arabs. One of the objectives of these classes is to supply the young doctors with tools to recognize in the first place ethical dilemmas in their practice. And I personally believe that physicians should not be limited to the dilemmas inside the room, inside the clinic, and in my classes, I try to encourage them to see the whole picture in a larger scope of their patient's health and their profession as doctors, and their obligation to see themselves as leaders, actually, to ensure the right to get medical care equally for everyone, just like we are supposed to do according to the oath of Hippocrates, which was wrought thousands of years ago. Last month, me and my colleague decided to talk about the value of human dignity. That was the issue we discussed. And we brought the article that Hadas mentioned before about one of the doctors that treated the detainees in Sde Teiman and published it in Haaretz a few weeks ago anonymously. In this article, the doctor describes the atrocities done in Sde Teiman and the ethical dilemmas he faced treating them. After the student read the article, we made a discussion about its contents and from ethical and moral aspects. Different opinions were expressed, but it was shocking in my eyes that some doctors found it normal to treat prisoners in this way, and it didn't feel problematic to them that some prisoners had their hands to be amputated after continuous shackling. They said, so what? They are dangerous terrorists, so some said. This is actually an excuse that justified everything. The feeling was that in Israel, actually, there are no red lines, no more ethical red lines, because the dehumanization policy that Israel is leading against all the 2 million citizens in Gaza since October 7th is penetrating deeply also to the medical system. That's what we are seeing. Later, some of these students sent a letter to the manager of the program complaining about the lesson. They described it as an attempt to force my political agenda. The manager asked us not to hold political explosive discussions in this program, explaining that this is the policy since October 7th. And I would like to highlight the fact that since October 7th, the hostages and the soldiers that were killed in Gaza are mentioned in every possible opportunity in this program, while totally ignoring the atrocities and in the jails and the tens of thousands of innocent people killed in Gaza, including children, as if that is not political. So in the light of that, I decided to quit teaching medical ethics, because this issue is really challenging these days in Israel, as Hadas mentioned before. So I think that this is exactly the picture. Mm-hmm.
If I may, I also would like to add on that we know of medical teams in hospitals who, not only the hospitals were refusing to treat Gazan detainees. In hospitals that they did admit Gazan patients, there were medical personnel who refused to treat Gazan patients, and they were needed to be replaced with others. Some who did treat them justified as helping the interrogators and keeping them alive. And as Hadas mentioned, and some said that they would give them only the bare minimum, and painkillers were considered a privilege. Another thing, another example for how the time has its effect inside prison is so the lack of food, the violence, and the extreme overcrowding, the fact that people doesn't have other clothes, led to outbreak of widespread skin disease, especially scabies. There are hundreds of cases that we know of in prisons in the south, and also some in the north, in Megiddo prison. You know, the lack of hygiene. The prison service is refusing to provide hygiene products, or to provide clean clothes, or to allow to bring inside prison clean clothes. And really, it's one of the things that we are dealing with at the moment is this hundreds of cases, and it's only continuing because of these conditions and the way the prison service is handling that. And just another thing regarding the autopsies, there were autopsies in prison that were done without notifying the family. And still, even though we are talking about cases that some of them happened already in October, there are no final reports on the autopsies. You mentioned the cases of Dr. Adnan El-Bursh. This is the only case that the Israeli authority notified the Palestinian authority about his death, and this was also about 2 weeks after he died. Still, there was no autopsy, and it happened around the beginning of May. We don't know exactly. And the case of Yad Rantisi, he died around November, and the a notification for his death was published only last week.
So I think this issue of lack of access to information, how many incarcerated Palestinians died, under what circumstances, their families receiving some basic information about their well-being, is a good transition into one question that we received by email, which was somebody who said that when she has talked about what's happening at Sde Teiman, people around her have responded with skepticism about some of the testimonies coming out of there. And she asked how we address the reliability of information coming out. What are our most reliable sources? How can we be sure we know what we know about what's happening? And this is to any of you who would like to respond.
We can't hear you, Hadas.
I always forget to unmute. I would say something very simple. When a whistleblower endanger himself or herself and coming out of there with the information, I have no reason to doubt them. So as far as the whistleblowers, I think that they really took a risk. And maybe this is also talking about pessimism and optimism, like this is like a crack in the wall through which I see a light. Whistleblowers are reliable. Some of them I know for many, many years. So I have no reason to doubt it. Also, medical files are reliable because it's, as they say, from the mouth of the horse. Israeli doctors sign them. They describe what is there. And of course, the testimonies of prisoners for me are also reliable, especially if you see many people from different places, different times, describe the same things. So that's the information. And I suppose breaking the silence, who get information from soldiers, will, at the end of the war or at some point, will also be a very informative source.
It's also worth mentioning that at this stage, there are people who have been released from Sde Teiman and can testify themselves about the conditions they experienced there. We received another question earlier on, which was for Oneg. When you mentioned in your first question the cases of sexual abuse that we've encountered of incarcerated Palestinians, could you elaborate on the sexual abuse and what does it amount to? How common is it? And have we seen a change since October?
Yeah, I mean, so as I mentioned also before, we had cases of people who suffered from sexual abuse in detention. I mean, and now it's really it's basically kind of on a daily basis. I mean, it's really on a different level. It can, I mean, prison guards were doing in the first months of the war, they were doing raids inside the wards, and we heard testimonies of people who said that they undressed them, they made them rub against each other, inserted objects into their anus and private places, and it continues in different ways, also till today. Yeah, I mean, there are quite, unfortunately, there are several testimonies regarding sexual abuse.
So I see there's one more question here, and we can address that and then maybe begin to wrap up. I would just like to apologize to people who tried to join and faced some technical difficulties with the YouTube link. I hope everybody's here now, but if people missed a lot of the beginning, the entire webinar will be available and recorded after the fact on YouTube and Facebook. But sorry if you missed the live portion. So this is an open question for any of you who would like to respond. Can you give some information about female prisoners as well as the elderly and children that you mentioned briefly?
As far as we know, there are about, at the moment, in Damun prison in the north, about 80 women, female, who are being detained. And regarding minors, there are about 250, and there are dozens of Gazan minors who are especially we know in Offer prison in Megiddo. And regarding the elderlies, what is
there was the case you mentioned of the woman, the 82-year-old woman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she was held in the Moon prison, and we heard from other detainees about her. We asked to visit her, and the prison service said she's basically she doesn't have access to lawyer visit. She's denied of a lawyer visit because she is classified as unlawful combatant. And then we appealed to court, and a few days later, they released her back to the Gaza Strip. She was also arrested with her caregiver, and her caregiver, they kept her after they released Fahmi.
Lina and Hadas and Oneg, are there any final remarks or topics you think we should have touched on and didn't before we wrap up this conversation?
I just would like to highlight the fact that the situation is not. We talked a lot about the Gazan detainees, but also the detainees from the West Bank are facing very difficult conditions and torturing, and the situation there is not very good. Hadas, you are muted again.
I want to say that as we speak to an international audience, there's a role not only to the Israeli Society or to the Israeli Medical Association, but also to the World Medical Association to support those medical teams that want to stay ethical but are pressured and are silenced. So there's definitely a lot to be supported and hopefully bring up the change that we want to see.
And I would say that some of the tools that we were using before, appealing to court, internal advocacy to different decision makers in Israel, after the war, it became completely not something that we can use and that's why we think that only with international pressure we can change the situation, and we believe that the international attention, for instance, on Sde Teiman helped with the closure of this with the decrease of and the change that is happening. So I would ask for more international pressure.
So I think one takeaway for me from this conversation is that human rights work is an uphill struggle, and even when you have one success, there's the problem sometimes moves somewhere else or needs to be dealt with in different ways. But I do still think we need to take moments to pause and say, this was something that we and the human rights community and whistleblowers and international press and international decision makers brought to light and created momentum and pressure around. And that is a moment worth remembering. And I don't want to say celebrating, because nothing feels very celebratory at the moment, but still remembering that we do have the power to push back against these kinds of grave human rights violations. So thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. Thank you to everybody who participated. If you'd like to learn more about our work and about what's happening in the Israeli detention system at the moment, PHRI has put out a position paper on the ethical violations of medical ethics at Sde Teiman, which you can find on our website, and a more comprehensive report on the broader crisis in Israeli incarceration since October, which can also be found on our website. Thank you for joining, and have a good day or evening wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.